There are men who enter your life like a wound, quiet, unannounced. But by the time you realize it, the blood is already flowing. Adrian Moretti was that kind of man. Powerful, dangerous, and deadly in a way no crime report could ever fully capture. Nora Vale knew she shouldn't look back. But that night, amidst the rain and thunder on the awning behind the Bellavino restaurant, when he stood less than a step away from her and said things no one was supposed to know, she understood that her life had just split in two, before Adrian and after Adrian. Which city are you watching from? Please like and comment your city name below to let me know how far this story has progressed. The kitchen at Bellavino on a Thursday night wasn't a workplace. It was a controlled emergency. Flames punched upward from cast iron burners with the kind of heat that dried the eyes out after 10 minutes and blistered the forearm if you leaned too close. The hood vents roared. Sheet pans crashed against steel countertops. Somewhere behind the cold station, a prep cook was cursing in Portuguese loud enough to be heard over the ventilation system, and nobody told him to stop because everyone was either moving too fast to care or had long since accepted the noise as part of the architecture. Nora Vale worked the floor the way she did everything else, without permission, without fanfare, without looking up unless it was absolutely necessary. She was 24, looked 29. Her hair was pulled back with a rubber band she'd found on the prep counter, and her black work shirt had a small grease burn above the left hip she'd stopped noticing 2 weeks ago. She carried 4 plates at a time when the expediter was backed up, which he always was on Thursday, because Thursday was when Chef Raymond decided to add specials to the menu without telling anyone in advance and then acted personally offended when the orders came in wrong. "Swordfish is off," she said to the pass without breaking stride. The expediter looked up from his ticket board. "What?" "Swordfish, we got a bad delivery yesterday. Raymond let it sit. It's off." She set the 4 plates onto the pass without rattling a single one and was already turning back toward the dining room. 86 it before table 7 sends theirs back and ruins their whole night. She didn't wait to see if he did it. She already knew he would. This was what Nora had become. Not what she'd planned. Not what she'd spent 2 years studying for at Suffolk Law before the tuition ran out, and Elijah's diagnosis arrived in the same month like a joke, without a punchline. She had become someone who moved through difficult environments with surgical efficiency because the alternative was falling apart. And falling apart was not something Nora Vale had the budget for. Her brother was 18, autoimmune, expensive, brilliant in the way that kids from broke families sometimes were. Studying on borrowed library computers, applying for scholarships he was almost certainly too proud to accept, refusing to let Nora pay for the textbooks she bought anyway, and left on the kitchen table where he'd find them and pretend he hadn't noticed her handwriting on the receipt. She loved him in the particular way you love something that is both your purpose and your wound. The dining room at Bellavino on a Thursday night was full. The restaurant seated 80. The lighting was warm amber over white tablecloths, real candles, the kind of place that charged $40 for a pasta course and expected you to feel grateful for the privilege. Nora navigated between tables without looking at the floor, reciting orders in her head, tracking which table had been waiting too long, which server had disappeared into the back for reasons she'd deal with after close. She was refilling water at table 11 when she heard it. Not a sound? Exactly. A shift. The way a room changes pressure when a door opens onto a cold night, even when no door has opened. She looked up. 3 men had entered through the main entrance. 2 of them were built like construction equipment, wide, quiet, placed at angles that blocked the room in ways that weren't accidental. They weren't looking at the menu. They were looking at the perimeter. The 3rd man stood between them, and Nora understood immediately, with the clarity of someone who had spent years reading rooms for safety, that the 2 large men existed entirely in relation to him. He was tall, not in the way of someone who'd been tall their whole life and learned to fold themselves apologetically into the world. He was tall in the way of someone who had decided a long time ago that space belonged to him and had not encountered sufficient contradiction since. Dark suit, no tie, a jaw that looked like it had been set wrong after something broke it. A scar ran from below his left ear down toward his chin in a thin, pale line that had the controlled patience of an old wound, the kind that happens once and never again. The owner, Marco, crossed the floor with a speed Nora had genuinely never witnessed from him. He was 62 years old with a bad knee and a general philosophy of letting his staff handle the dining room. She had seen him get up from his corner table exactly 4 times in 18 months, and 3 of those were for plumbing emergencies. He was straightening his tie as he walked. Nora watched him grip the man's hand with both of his. She turned back to the water pitcher. He's a regular, she told herself. A rich regular. This city had plenty of them. Real estate developers who'd bought half the waterfront, venture people who'd moved up from New York with their families and their certainty, the occasional inherited money type who'd never learned to eat with uncertainty in the room. Nora had poured water for all of them. She didn't need to know his name. She crossed back toward the service station, and Daniela, one of the other servers, caught her arm. "That's Adrian Moretti," Daniela said. Her voice was doing something between reverence and terror that Nora found immediately tedious. "Okay, Nora, I heard you. Do you know who that is?" "I know he needs a table for 3, Nora said, "which is Ricky's section, so Ricky can handle it." Daniela looked at her the way people sometimes looked at Nora, like they weren't sure whether she was genuinely fearless or genuinely didn't understand the situation. The answer, most of the time, was that Nora understood the situation perfectly and had simply decided that fear was a luxury she could not afford during a double shift. She was at the pass collecting a plate for table 6 when she heard Marco's voice call her name. She turned. Marco was standing near the host stand, and beside him was Moretti, and the look on Marco's face was the specific combination of discomfort and forced pleasantry that Nora associated with situations where someone powerful wanted something they hadn't requested through normal channels. "Nora," Marco said, "Mr. Moretti asked for you specifically." She carried the plate back to the pass, set it down with care, and walked over. Up close, Adrian Moretti was different than he'd appeared from across the room. Not less intimidating, just more specific. His eyes were dark and still, not cold exactly, but settled, the way water settles when there's weight below the surface. He looked at her the way most powerful men didn't bother to look at waitstaff, which was to say he actually looked, with attention, without the performance of either dismissal or aggressive courtesy. She met his gaze and kept her face neutral. "I usually get the swordfish," he said. His voice was quieter than she'd expected, controlled. A voice that had learned not to need volume. "The swordfish is a mistake tonight," Nora said. Something shifted in his expression, not anger. "Marco usually lets me order what I want." "Marco doesn't work the line. The swordfish came in wrong yesterday, and Chef let it sit too long. It'll be fine. It'll taste exactly like it always does." She paused. "But it won't be right. You'll know the difference." The 2 men standing behind Moretti had gone very, very still. Marco looked like he was doing long division in his head. Adrian Moretti looked at Nora for 3 full seconds without speaking, which she suspected was unusual for him. "What would you recommend?" he said finally. "Sea bass. It came in this morning. Raymond did something with a blood orange reduction that he'll be insufferable about for weeks, but it's actually worth it." A pause. "Sea bass," he repeated. "Yes." "Fine." She turned and walked back to the floor, and she felt his eyes follow her, and she noted that feeling and set it aside the way she set aside most things that could not be acted upon during service. The night continued. Orders moved, plates went out. The kitchen hit its usual catastrophic peak around 9:15 and recovered by 9:45. Nora collected the check for table 11, ran a birthday dessert to table 4, handled a complaint about a corkage fee with the minimum number of words required to resolve it, and kept moving. She did not look at table 12 again until nearly 11, when the dining room had emptied to its last few tables and the sound of the kitchen had dropped from a roar to a low industrial hum. Adrian Moretti was still there. His 2 associates had left sometime around 10. He sat alone with a glass of something amber and no phone on the table, which Nora noted because she could not remember the last time she'd seen a man under 70 sitting alone in a restaurant without performing the ritual of phone consultation. She cleared a nearby 2-top and began resetting it. "You were right," he said. She didn't turn around. "About the fish." "About the fish." She kept working, folded the new napkin, set the fork. "The woman who told me I was ordering wrong," he said, and walked away before I could respond. "That was a normal recommendation. I do it for everyone." "No one does that for me." Nora set down the second fork and turned to face him. Mr. Moretti, with respect, I don't know what you're used to, but I have 10 side work tasks before I can go home tonight, and my shift ends at midnight, and if you have a concern about the service, I can get Marco. Something happened in his expression that she couldn't fully name. Not amusement, exactly. Something older than amusement. No concern, he said. She nodded once and went back to work. She was rolling silverware in the service station when Daniela appeared at her elbow and said quietly, "He asked for you to come outside." Nora looked up. He left already, paid the check, tipped 60%, which, oh my God, but he left a card. He said if you were willing, he'd like to speak with you on the patio. Daniela hesitated. I told him I'd pass it along. You don't have to. Nora looked at the card Daniela held out. Thick paper, matte black, a name printed in simple type. A phone number, nothing else. She looked out toward the back patio doors. Finish my silverware roll-ups, Nora said, and she took the card, and she went. The patio behind Bellavino was a narrow strip of flagstone that overlooked a back alley and a fire escape on the building opposite. In summer, it held 4 small tables for overflow. In October, it was cold enough that the restaurant had stopped seating there a week ago, and the furniture was stacked against the brick wall under a tarp. The overhead string lights were still on, though, white bulbs strung between 2 iron poles, and they threw down a thin, warm light that did very little against the dark. It had started raining sometime during service. She hadn't noticed. She noticed now. The flagstones were wet, and the air smelled like wet concrete and something industrial from the alley, and the sound of the city, traffic, distant sirens, the particular low frequency of a metropolis that never fully sleeps, came over the roofline in rolling waves. Adrian Moretti stood at the far edge of the patio with his back to her, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at nothing in particular in the alley below. He turned when he heard the door. They stood about 10 feet apart. The string lights put his scar in shadow, and the rain had put a fine mist across his jacket, and he looked for a moment like something that had been standing in this specific spot for a long time. You didn't have to come, he said. I know. Then why did you? Nora crossed her arms against the cold. Because if I didn't, you'd probably show up again next Thursday, and this would keep going. He almost smiled. It didn't reach the scar. That's a practical reason. I'm a practical person. He turned more fully toward her, and she held her ground, which she suspected he was noting, the way she had noted that he stood slightly to the left of the center of any space he occupied, which she'd learned once from a self-defense course meant someone who'd been trained to watch exits. I looked into you, he said. The words hit like a physical thing, but she didn't let them move her. Your brother, he continued. Elijah. Autoimmune presentation. 2 specialists. 3rd opinion still pending. You dropped out of Suffolk Law approximately 22 months ago. Before that, you testified in the assault case against a bouncer who hurt 3 women in Charlestown. You were the only witness who didn't walk back her statement. The rain picked up slightly. It fell between them in a thin curtain, and the string lights caught it and made it visible. That was published in court records, Nora said, and her voice was level, which took effort. Most people wouldn't have held, he said. The defense firm was expensive. They were very thorough. Why do you know any of this? He looked at her with those settled, weighted eyes. Because I wanted to. That's not an answer. It's the honest one. Nora uncrossed her arms. Mr. Moretti, I don't know what you think you're doing, but I need you to hear me clearly. I'm a waitress who told you to order the sea bass. That's it. That's the whole transaction. Whatever story you're building in your head about that moment, it's not real. I know what's real, he said. Then you know this is inappropriate. Yes. And you're doing it anyway. Yes. The thunder came then, low, rolling, somewhere over the harbor, the kind of sound that didn't so much arrive as unfold across the sky. Nora felt it in her sternum before she heard it fully. Adrian Moretti crossed the patio toward her with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never in his adult life been told to stop, and she stood still because there was something happening in her chest that was not fear, but lived next to fear like a neighbor, and she was still working out the difference. He stopped close. Too close. close enough that she could see the rain on his jaw and the way the scar caught the string light. And then he kissed her. Not violent, not soft, certain. The way you do something you've decided and are not uncertain about. She shoved him back with both palms flat against his chest, hard enough that he stepped back, and the look on his face was not anger. "Touch me again," she said, and her voice was completely steady, which surprised even her. "And I will burn every single thing you have built to the ground." He looked at her for a long moment, and then Adrian Moretti smiled, slowly, like something moving in deep water. And it was the first expression she'd seen on him that seemed to come from somewhere uncontrolled. "I believe you," he said. She went back inside. She finished her side work. She clocked out at 12:14. She walked to the tea stop in the rain without an umbrella because she'd forgotten it again, and she was angry about something she couldn't yet name. She told herself the anger was about the violation, which it was. She told herself it was about the presumption, which it also was. She did not tell herself what it was about the certainty in his eyes, or the particular quality of the silence between them on that rain-wet patio, or the fact that when she'd pressed her palms against his chest to push him away, she had felt exactly how still he'd gone beneath her hands. She got on the train. She thought about her brother. She thought about the court case 3 years ago and the defense attorney who had spent 4 hours trying to make her feel small, and the way she'd sat in that hard chair and answered every single question without looking away. She thought about Adrian Moretti saying, "I believe you like a man setting something down he'd been carrying for a while." The train moved through the dark underground and the other passengers stared at their phones or slept against the windows, and Nora Vale sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the black glass of the window opposite and saw her own face looking back. She told herself she would not think about it anymore. She thought about it the entire ride home. 3 days later, on a Sunday morning, she arrived at the restaurant to find Marco waiting for her with an expression that meant news she hadn't asked for. "You've got paid leave," he said. "Effective immediately. 2 months, full rate. Anonymous donor to the staff fund." Nora looked at him. "Marco?" "I know," he said, and he looked genuinely uncomfortable, which on Marco was a significant facial event. "I know, Nora. I told them I needed to ask you first." "Who is them?" He said nothing. She already knew. She stood in the restaurant that still smelled like last night's garlic and butter and closing product, and she thought about 2 months of rent covered, 2 months of Elijah's medications not coming out of her tips, 2 months of time she hadn't had in 22 months, and she thought about what it meant that someone had bought that time for her without asking. That night, she found a note in her apartment building mailbox. Her full name on the envelope, handwritten. Inside, a card for a specialist. Dr. Miriam Holt. The best autoimmune practice in New England, Nora happened to know, because she'd looked them up 6 months ago and calculated that the out-of-pocket consultation fee alone was 3 weeks of her income. The appointment was already made. Elijah's name was already on it. She stood in the hallway of her building with the card in both hands and the fluorescent light buzzing above her, and she felt something that was complicated and hot and not entirely welcome move through her chest. She took the stairs to their apartment. Elijah was at the kitchen table with his laptop and 3 library books and a bowl of cereal he'd forgotten to eat. "Hey," he said without looking up. "Hey," she said. She put the card on the table beside his cereal bowl. He looked at it, looked at her. "Nora." "Don't," she said. "This is from—" "I know who it's from." He picked it up carefully, read the doctor's name. "How?" "Elijah." He looked at her, and she saw in his face the thing she always saw and worked hard not to acknowledge. The guilt he carried about being sick, about costing her things, about the law school she'd left that he understood had been left partly for him. "You didn't ask for this?" he said. "No." "But you're going to let it happen." Nora looked at her brother, 19 years old and brilliant and sick, and the only person she would do truly reckless things for. "I haven't decided yet," she said. But standing there in the kitchen, under the single overhead light, with the sound of the city coming through the window and the appointment card on the table between them, she was already lying. She had already decided. And somewhere across the city, she understood with a cold and specific clarity, Adrian Moretti already knew that too. The next morning, a black sedan sat across the street from her building. It was there when she left for the restaurant at 9:30, and still there when she returned at 11:45. She did not call anyone. She did not take a photo. She walked past it without breaking her stride and felt its presence on her back, like a hand that had not yet touched down. It would be 6 more days before Mateo Rivas knocked on her door. By then, the word leverage would mean something it had never meant before. Mateo Rivas knocked on her door at 7:43 in the morning, which Nora knew because she'd been awake since 5 and had watched the clock the way you watch something you're afraid of but can't look away from. She hadn't slept well in 6 days. Not since the sedan, not since the appointment card, not since she'd started noticing the small wrongnesses in her routine. The feeling of being observed that she couldn't locate, couldn't confirm, could only feel in the back of her neck the way animals feel weather before it arrives. She looked through the peephole. The man outside was compact and dark-haired, somewhere in his late 30s, wearing a jacket that was too light for the October cold and carrying nothing in his hands, which she noted because people who came to deliver bad news usually held something. A clipboard, a phone, something to look at when the conversation became difficult. His hands were empty and at his sides and completely still. She opened the door on the chain. "Ms. Vale," he said. His voice was flat and accented slightly, something Mediterranean, worn smooth by years of English. "My name is Mateo Rivas. I work for Adrian Moretti. I need 5 minutes." "I don't know Adrian Moretti," she said. "You do," he said, without unkindness, without pressure. Just a statement of fact set down between them. "And the situation has changed in ways that involve you whether you've agreed to it or not. 5 minutes. I'll stand in the hallway the entire time if you prefer." She looked at him through the gap for another 3 seconds. She closed the door, took the chain off, opened it. He stood in the hallway, as promised. She leaned against the door frame with her arms crossed and her feet bare on the cold floor, and she watched him the way she'd learned to watch men who represented power she hadn't asked for, without performance, without softness, without any signal that she could be managed. "There's a syndicate," Mateo said. "They operate under the name Black Harbor. Trafficking, protection, extortion across the waterfront. Adrian has been in a territorial disagreement with them for approximately 14 months. He paused. 2 days ago, their intelligence identified a change in Adrian's behavior. What kind of change? The kind that creates vulnerability. He met her eyes. They believe he has an attachment, something personal. They've been watching him long enough to trace it back to the restaurant. The cold from the floor traveled up through her feet and settled somewhere around her stomach. "They know your name," Mateo said. "They know your brother's name. They've mapped your routes. The restaurant, the tea stop, the library on Boylston where your brother studies on Tuesdays." He said it without flinching, which she understood was a specific skill he had developed. "You are no longer an unknown quantity to dangerous people, Ms. Vale. I'm sorry for that. It is not something we planned." She said nothing for a moment. "What do you want from me?" she said. "Adrian wants to explain the situation to you himself. I'm here because he thought—" Mateo paused, and something moved across his face that might have been the closest he came to discomfort. "He thought you'd close the door on him. He thought you might not close it on me." "He was right about the door," Nora said. "Tell him I need 24 hours. Mateo nodded once, reached into his jacket, and produced a phone, plain, prepaid, the kind you couldn't trace in any direction that mattered. "This has 1 contact loaded. If anything feels wrong before the 24 hours are up, you call immediately. Don't hesitate. Don't try to assess the situation first." He held it out. She took it. He left. She stood in the doorway for a while after his footsteps faded down the stairwell, holding the prepaid phone in her hand, feeling the particular weight of an object that represented a door you couldn't unopen once you walked through it. She went inside. Elijah was still asleep. She could hear him through the thin wall of their apartment, the slow, even rhythm of someone who still trusted the world enough to sleep deeply, and she stood in the kitchen with the phone on the counter, and the appointment card still on the table, and she thought about what Mateo Rivas had just told her with the particular calm of someone delivering coordinates to a location you hadn't agreed to travel to. They knew Elijah's name. They knew the library on Boylston. She made coffee, drank it standing at the counter, didn't taste it. The 24 hours lasted 11. She called the number at 6:47 that evening from the fire escape of her building because she didn't want Elijah to hear the conversation and she needed cold air and open space and the ability to move if the urge came. Adrian answered on the second ring. "You called early," he said. "Don't make it about that," she said. "Tell me what I need to know." A pause. Brief. Waited. "Can you meet me?" "No." "Nor did." I said no. "I'm not going anywhere with you until you tell me what I'm actually dealing with. Talk." The fire escape was cold, and the city moved below her, and somewhere 2 blocks over a car alarm had been going off for 40 minutes. She stood with her shoulder against the iron railing and listened to Adrian Moretti's voice come through a prepaid phone and tell her, in the stripped-down language of someone who had learned to communicate without unnecessary weight, exactly what Black Harbor was. He didn't soften it. That was the thing she noticed most. He didn't edit for her comfort. He said trafficking with the same flat precision as he said waterfront, said violence the way he said logistics. He talked about the syndicate's structure and reach and the specific way they'd built themselves into the city's infrastructure over a decade, and he talked about what they did to people they identified as pressure points. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How many people know I've been identified?" "On their side, probably 6. On mine," he paused. "Everyone who needs to." That's not an answer. It's the honest one. She recognized the phrase. He'd used it on the patio in the rain 10 days ago. She didn't say that. "What do you want to do?" she said. "I want you somewhere I can protect you." "That's what you want. What are the options?" He was quiet for a moment, and she got the sense that he wasn't used to the question being separated that way, what he wanted from what was possible. "You stay where you are," he said slowly. "I put people on your building, your brother's library, the restaurant. It's manageable, but it's not invisible, and it changes your life in ways I can't fully control." Or, another pause. "You come somewhere I can control the variables." Define somewhere. He told her about the penthouse, 15th floor of a building he owned outright in the financial district. 2 units, connected by an internal door that could be locked from either side. She registered that detail, the way it was offered, and understood it was offered deliberately. Private elevator access, staff she'd never see unless she needed something. Elijah could have his own space, his own desk, quiet enough to study. "How long?" she said. "Until the situation is resolved." "That's not a time frame." "No," he said. "It isn't." She looked down at the street below. A woman was walking a dog. A delivery driver was double-parked and arguing with someone on the phone. The ordinary movements of a city that did not know it contained, inside its normal Friday evening, a conversation like this one. "I need to talk to my brother," she said. "Of course." "If he says no, I stay, and you put the people on the building." "Agreed." "And Moretti." She waited. "If I do this, if I agree to this, it's not because of anything that happened on that patio. Do you understand me?" The pause this time was different, shorter. "I understand," he said. She didn't believe him entirely. She went inside and made dinner and sat across from Elijah and watched him eat the pasta she'd made from a box because it was all they had, and waited for the right moment, which didn't come naturally, so she made it. She told him most of it. Not the cartel's full scope, not the word trafficking. She told him there were people who'd connected her to someone she'd met at work, that this person had resources, and there was a safer place they could be for a while, that the doctor's appointment would still happen. She'd confirmed that, and that Elijah's scholarship applications could be finished from anywhere with a desk and an internet connection. Elijah put his fork down. He looked at her with the particular expression of a 19-year-old who was significantly more perceptive than convenient. "Who is this person?" he said. "Someone with complications." That's a very careful way of not answering. "Elijah." "Is he dangerous?" She held his gaze. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. "Are you in danger if we don't go?" "Potentially." "Are you in danger if we do?" "Less." He picked his fork back up, looked at his pasta. "I don't love this." "I know." "I really don't love this, Nora." "I know." He ate. She ate. The radiator knocked against the wall the way it always did. "Okay," he said finally, quietly. "Okay." They moved the next morning, 2 bags each. Elijah brought 4 books and his laptop and a framed photo of their mother that he wrapped in a sweater and placed at the top of his bag with a carefulness that made Nora's chest hurt in the specific way that things hurt when you're trying not to let them. The penthouse was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have named clearly what she'd expected. It was large and quiet and tastefully spare, the kind of space decorated by someone who understood that money should be felt rather than announced. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the financial district, and beyond that the harbor, iron gray under the November sky, and the light came in clean and cold and filled the rooms without warmth. Elijah walked to the window and looked out and said, "Huh," in the tone of someone deciding to withhold judgment. Nora found her bedroom, put her bag on the floor, and sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 4 minutes, which was as long as she could afford to feel what she was feeling before she had to stop. She saw Adrian for the first time in 11 days that evening. He came through the internal connecting door, knocked first, which she noted, and stood in the entrance of the living room with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he looked, she thought, more tired than she'd seen him. Not weak. Tired. The specific tiredness of someone managing too many moving things. "How's the space?" he said. "Fine." "Elijah settled?" "He's studying. He's fine." She was standing by the window. She didn't move toward him. "I want ground rules." "Name them." "That door stays locked unless one of us knocks. Elijah doesn't see anything related to your business. Nobody comes into this unit without my knowledge, including your people. And," she looked at him directly, "whatever happened on the patio doesn't happen again without my clear agreement. If I don't say yes, it doesn't happen. Are we clear?" Something moved behind his eyes. "Clear?" "Good." He nodded, turned to go. "Moretti." He stopped. "Why me?" she said. "Specifically, there have to be women who don't tell you to go to hell on patios in the rain." He stood with his back half turned, and she watched the slight shift in the set of his shoulders. "There are," he said. "Then why?" He turned enough to look at her. The scar caught the lamplight the same way it had caught the string lights 11 days ago. "Because every one of them knew what I was before they looked at me," he said. "You looked first." He went back through the door. She stood at the window for a long time after. The next 2 weeks had a structure that Nora had not anticipated and didn't know how to categorize. It was not normal life. It was not captivity exactly, though the word sat in the back of her throat sometimes when she was most honest with herself. It was something in between, a suspension, a held breath. She couldn't work the restaurant. Marco had been told she was on extended leave and paid accordingly, and she hated the idleness with a physical intensity, the way inactivity felt like sand in the joints of someone built for movement. She read. She ran the building's gym at 6 every morning until the sweat came hard enough to quiet her head. She sat with Elijah in the evenings and reviewed his scholarship essays, crossing out the polished language and replacing it with the real version, the true version, the one that said, "I am this specific person from this specific life," rather than the careful performance of the person a committee wanted to fund. She saw Adrian in the evenings. Not every evening, not always for long, but with a regularity that built itself into her awareness whether she cataloged it or not. He worked late. She could hear movement through the connecting door, muted voices, the low murmur of a phone call, the particular silence of a man reviewing documents at midnight. Sometimes he knocked and came through and sat at the far end of the kitchen table with a cup of espresso and whatever he was working on, and she sat at the other end with her book or her own laptop, and they didn't always speak, and the not speaking was something she noticed had its own texture. One night he helped Elijah draft a cover letter for a STEM scholarship, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Adrian Moretti, who she knew, in the factual and terrible way you know things, read her brother's draft, set it down, and say, "This is too careful. You're writing like someone who's afraid they don't deserve it. Write like you know you do." And Elijah had looked at him, and then looked at the page and said, "Yeah, okay," and started over. She went back to her side of the table. She didn't say anything about it. 3 days later, he told her about his father. Not as a story, not as a confession. They were standing in the kitchen after midnight, which had become the hour when most things happened between them because the day had exhausted its performance by then and left only what was real. And he was making espresso, and she was reading a casebook she'd borrowed from a library database. And he said, without preamble, "My father ran the empire for 20 years. When he died, I was 26 and not ready, and it didn't matter, because ready doesn't factor into inheritance in this business." She looked up. He kept his back to her, working the espresso machine. "I spent about 3 years becoming what the position required. Things I made happen that I can't make unhappen." He paused. "I'm not telling you this for absolution. I don't want it, and I don't think it's yours to give." "Then why are you telling me?" He turned around, set her cup on the table without asking if she wanted it, which was something he'd started doing, knowing she always wanted it, never asking, just setting it down. "Because you've been looking at me for 3 weeks trying to figure out which category I belong in, and I'm tired of watching you work on a puzzle that doesn't have the right pieces yet." She looked at the cup, looked at him. "What category do you belong in?" "None of the standard ones," he said. She drank the espresso. It was good. It was always good. She hated how much she'd come to rely on that small, specific thing. The call came on a Tuesday night at 11:58. She knew it was serious before Matteo finished the first sentence because she heard the quality of Adrian's silence through the connecting door, the specific absence of sound from a man who had gone very, very still. She set her book down. She heard, "Matteo." She heard the word warehouse. She heard Adrian say something in a language she didn't know. 3 words, flat and final, and then nothing. She knocked on the connecting door. He opened it. He looked at her for a moment, and his face was different than she'd ever seen it. Not broken. Nothing as simple as that. It was the face of a man who had just had the floor shifted under him and was still deciding where to put his weight. "Matteo's been taken," he said. The words landed in the room with their full weight. "Black Harbor," he said. "They grabbed him coming out of a parking structure in the South End. We have about 6 hours before the situation becomes irreversible." She stood in the doorway between their 2 spaces and looked at him. "They want to trade," Adrian said, and his voice was completely controlled, which she understood now was not calm. It was the thing that lived on the other side of calm, past it, in the territory where emotion has been converted entirely into function. "They want you," he said, "in exchange for Matteo." The building's heat system clicked on somewhere in the walls. Nora stood very still. "And," she said. He looked at her. "There's an and," she said. "I can see it." His jaw moved once. "If I refuse the trade, they'll kill him to make the point. If I accept—" He stopped. "If you accept," she said quietly, "you lose me and you lose the leverage, and they'll know they can move you." "Yes." She crossed her arms. The cold that had been living in her stomach for 3 weeks had clarified into something more specific now, something harder and less ambiguous. "Have you done it before?" she said. "Traded a person?" "No." "Would you?" The silence lasted exactly long enough to be honest. "Not you," he said. And the way he said it, not soft, not tender, stripped entirely of performance, was more frightening than anything he could have said with more words. Nora uncrossed her arms, looked at the wall, looked back at him. "Then we need to find another way," she said. "There isn't one. Not in 6 hours. Not with the information I said we need to find another way." Her voice had gone very flat, the way it went when she'd made a decision she wasn't happy about and had decided to stop being unhappy about it and start moving. "Sit down. Tell me everything you know about Black Harbor's structure. Everything. Who they've paid, who's turned, who they've threatened that might flip." She pulled out a chair from the kitchen table. "I spent 2 years in law school studying criminal case architecture and 18 months working in a restaurant full of men who talk too freely around the waitstaff. You'd be surprised what overlaps." Adrian looked at her. He did not move for a moment. Then he sat down. And somewhere across the city, in whatever dark and cold place Matteo Rivas was being held, the clock kept running, and Nora Vale spread her hands flat on the kitchen table and began to build something out of nothing, the way she had always built everything, because the alternative was to... The clock on the kitchen wall said 12:17. Nora had her hands flat on the table and a legal pad she'd found in the kitchen drawer in front of her, and a pen she'd already pressed hard enough into the paper to tear through the first sheet. Adrian sat across from her with his phone face down and his espresso untouched, and his eyes on her with the particular quality of attention that she had learned over 3 weeks of proximity meant he was deciding how much to give. "Stop deciding," she said without looking up. "We don't have time for you to manage what I can handle. Talk." He talked. He talked for 40 minutes without stopping, and Nora wrote, and the legal pad filled with names and structures and the specific geography of corruption, which Port Authority officials had been on Black Harbor's payroll for how long, which city councilmen had accepted 3 payments in the last 18 months in exchange for zoning decisions that let certain warehouses operate without inspection, which federal contractor had been quietly funneling equipment requisitions through a shell company registered in Delaware. She wrote it all down. Her handwriting got smaller and faster as the picture assembled itself. "Stop," she said at 1:15. He stopped. She looked at what she'd written. Her eyes moved across the names, the dates, the dollar amounts he'd given her with the precision of someone who had kept this information in his head like a loaded weapon for years, waiting for the moment when pulling it out would cost less than keeping it in. "You have documentation for any of this," she said. "Most of it." "Where?" "Off-site. Physical copies. 3 locations I rotate." "Can you get to them in..." She checked the clock. 5 hours and 40 minutes. "One of them, yes." "Which one?" "The harbor location, 20-minute drive." She looked at the legal pad. "The councilman. Hargrove." She tapped the name. "He's been paid 3 times, which means he's not ideologically committed. He's economically committed. That's different. That's a man who told himself it was a one-time thing and kept making exceptions. He's scared." She looked up. "Is he scared?" Something shifted in Adrian's expression. "How do you know that from 3 payments?" "Because he took the 3rd one. The first one you take because you're desperate or greedy or both. The second one you take because you've already crossed the line and the logic of sunk cost takes over. The 3rd one..." She set the pen down. "The 3rd one you take because you've started needing the money to manage the anxiety about the first 2. That's not greed anymore. That's a trap he built for himself. He knows it." She met Adrian's eyes. "Is he scared?" "He called my lawyer 4 months ago, unprompted, asking about exposure." "He's terrified," she said. "He'll flip." Adrian sat very still. "You want to use a city councilman as leverage against a cartel that has kidnapped my lieutenant. I want to use a city councilman as the first domino in a federal case that makes Black Harbor too expensive to continue operating." She picked up the pen. "If we hand Mateo back through a trade, they know they can move you. They'll do it again. Next time they won't ask first." She paused. "But if we give the FBI something big enough to make Black Harbor a national priority, something that creates so much institutional pressure that moving against you carries consequences they can't absorb, then the trade becomes unnecessary, because the cartel has a much larger problem than whatever they want from you." The silence in the kitchen had weight. "That takes time," Adrian said. "We have 5.5 hours. No. Building the full case takes time. Making the first contact doesn't." She looked at the clock. "Who do you know in federal law enforcement who isn't compromised?" The pause. "There's a name," he said carefully. "I need it." "Nora, what you're describing is..." "I know what it is," she said. "Say the name." He said it. She wrote it down. They worked until 3:40 in the morning, and by then the legal pad had 23 pages of notes, and Adrian had made 2 phone calls she hadn't asked about, and she had made one that she had, to a federal duty line, identifying herself by name and the name of the case she was about to describe, and asking for a 6 a.m. availability with the specific agent Adrian had named. The duty officer had been silent for 4 seconds. Then he'd said he would make the call. She set the prepaid phone down. Adrian was looking at her from across the table. "You understand what you just did," he said. "Yes." "Once you're in that room, I know. They'll use you. They'll use everything you give them and they'll want more, and it doesn't stop when Mateo comes home. You become a federal resource. That has a shape to it that doesn't go away. I know, Adrian. She held his gaze. But you were about to consider the trade. Don't tell me you weren't. I could see it. She let that sit for a second. I'm not a trade. His jaw was tight. Something behind his eyes had gone very still. No, he said. You're not. She got up, refilled her water, stood at the counter for a moment with her back to him and breathed, really breathed, the kind you do when you've been holding everything at surface level for hours and need to let it go somewhere deeper for just a moment. Get the documentation from the harbor location, she said. I need it before 6. He left at 3:52. She went to check on Elijah, who was asleep with his laptop open beside him, and 3 of the scholarship drafts printed and covered in his own handwriting, and she stood in his doorway for a while and watched him sleep, and felt the particular weight of what she'd just done settle into her fully, without the buffer of urgency and forward motion. She had called a federal line. She had given her name. She had started something that would not stop. She went back to the kitchen and sat with the legal pad and read through everything she'd written and waited for Adrian to come back. And the city outside the windows was very dark and very quiet in the way that cities only get between 4 and 5 in the morning, the hours when the night crowd has gone home and the day crowd hasn't started yet, and the world exists in a kind of held suspension. She did not sleep. Adrian returned at 4:41 with a leather portfolio that he set on the table without ceremony and opened to reveal documents she would spend the next 60 hours studying until she knew their contents better than the people who'd created them. But that came later. What came first was the meeting. The federal field office on the 3rd floor of a building near Government Center had the particular institutional quality of spaces designed to communicate authority without comfort. Gray carpet, fluorescent panels, a conference table with a scratch running the length of it that someone had covered with a piece of tape that had since half peeled. Special Agent Dana Reyes sat at the far end with a recorder and a legal pad of her own, and the expression of someone who had been called at 5 in the morning with information she'd been building toward for 2 years and was now trying to process the specific irony of where it had come from. She was 40, maybe 42, dark-haired, wearing a jacket over what looked like clothes she'd put on very quickly. She had looked at Adrian Moretti for a long time when he walked in, and then she had looked at Nora, and the look had been different, assessing, recalibrating, making room for a variable she hadn't anticipated. Ms. Vale, Reyes said. Agent Reyes, you understand this conversation is being recorded? Yes. And you're here voluntarily? Yes. Reyes looked at Adrian. And you? Adrian looked back at her. I'm here because she asked me to be. Something shifted on Reyes' face, not softness, recognition of something she hadn't anticipated finding. She set her pen down and picked it back up and said, Tell me about the Hargrove payments. Nora told her. She talked for 3 hours. By 9:15, the scratch on the table had a coffee cup ring beside it. From Reyes's 3rd refill, and the recorder had been replaced with a 2nd unit, and 2 other agents had come and gone, and Nora had a glass of water she'd been nursing for 40 minutes, and her voice had gone slightly rough around the edges. Mateo Rivas was extracted from a warehouse in Everett at 9:57 that morning. Not by a trade. By a coordinated response from a task force that had been given, through the previous night's conversation, the exact location of the warehouse, the number of men inside, the patrol pattern of the 2 external guards, and the specific legal mechanism by which the extraction could be made without tipping Black Harbor, that anything larger was in motion. Reyes had made 3 calls. Nobody asked how Adrian had known the warehouse location. Nobody asked in the way that meant they were writing it down. Nora was sitting in the conference room when she got the text from the prepaid phone. 2 words. Adrian's number. She already knew before she saw it. She put the phone face down on the table and sat with her hands in her lap and let herself feel 1 full minute of relief before she put it away and went back to work. Mateo was alive. The case was open, and the shape of her life had changed in a way she was still measuring. She didn't see Adrian alone again until that evening, when she came back through the connecting door to find him standing at the kitchen counter, drinking espresso and looking out at the harbor. And she stood in the doorway and said nothing, and he said nothing, and the city was going amber dark outside, and the lights were beginning to come up across the waterfront. Mateo? She said. Bruised. Nothing structural. He's home. She nodded. Reyes will want you back in 3 days, he said. She'll have documentation requests. It'll be ongoing. I know. He turned from the window, looked at her with the full attention that still, 3 weeks in, required some effort to hold without looking away. You should know, he said quietly, that what you did this morning ends certain things for me. Some relationships, some arrangements. When this case moves forward, he paused. There are people who will know I cooperated. The empire changes. Has to. I know, she said. I'm not. He stopped. Started differently. I'm not asking you to apologize for it. Good, she said, because I'm not going to. Something moved across his face that was very close to what people looked like when they were grateful for something they hadn't known to ask for. She went to the counter, poured her own espresso. They stood side by side at the counter for a while, not touching, looking at the harbor going dark, and it was the most ordinary moment they'd had, and it had the strange weight of ordinary moments that arrive inside extraordinary circumstances, heavier than they should be, more specifically real. She should have known later that it was the last ordinary moment for a while. She should have paid more attention to it. The next 3 days had their own compressed rhythm. Meetings, document review, a second session with Reyes, and a third with a federal prosecutor whose name she hadn't known before and would know very well after. Nora worked with the focused exhaustion of someone running on purpose rather than energy, and the legal pad gave way to a laptop Reyes's office provided, and the case began to take the shape of a real architecture rather than an emergency improvisation. On the 4th day, Mateo came to the penthouse. She had not seen him since the hallway conversation 3 weeks ago. He was thinner now. The warehouse had done something to his face that would take time to correct, a tightness around the eyes that sleep hadn't yet loosened. He sat across from her at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug and his posture straight in the way of people who have decided not to let their body show what the body knows. I want to say something, he said. Okay. What you did? The federal call? The documentation? The extraction? He looked at the mug. That was my life. I want you to know I understand that. Nora looked at him. You would have done it for someone else. Maybe. He met her eyes. I've been with Adrian for 11 years. I've never seen him make a choice because of a person. Not the way... He stopped, started more carefully. I want to be honest with you. I think you have the right to know what you're inside. Something in her chest shifted slightly. He built the situation, Mateo said. The first night, the restaurant. She went very still. He didn't walk in by accident, Mateo said. He knew who you were before the swordfish, before the patio. The case you testified in, the bouncer in Charlestown. One of the victims was the daughter of a man Adrian owed a debt to. He'd been following your record for 2 years. The mug sat between Mateo's hands without moving. The restaurant was chosen, the Thursday timing. He knew your shift. He knew you'd correct him on the order because he'd read your performance reviews and talked to Marco. The fluorescent panel above hummed its thin hum. The apartment situation, Mateo continued. Stop, Nora said. He stopped. She sat with the information for a moment, which was all she could afford right now, one moment of fully holding it before deciding what to do with it. Her hands were flat on the table. She noticed they were not shaking. She didn't know whether to be relieved about that or frightened. The cartel threat, she said. Was that real? Yes. Immediately, without hesitation. That was real. Everything from the parking lot forward was real. I need you to believe that. And before the parking lot? Mateo was quiet. The sedan's outside my building, she said, before you knocked on my door. Yes. His men. Yes. He was watching me. Yes. She stood up, went to the window. The harbor was cold and gray and entirely indifferent, and she looked at it for a long time, pressing her palms against the glass, feeling the cold come through. The specialist for Elijah, she said. That was before the cartel identified me. Yes. That was manipulation. Mateo said nothing. That was a man using my brother's illness to create a debt I hadn't agreed to. She turned from the window. Her voice was flat in the specific way that flat voices are flat. Not empty, but the opposite of empty, so full that there's no room for register. That was calculated. From the beginning. Yes, Matteo said. And I thought you should know, before it went further. She looked at him. Does he know you're telling me this? She said. No. Why are you? He met her gaze directly, without flinching, without the management she'd come to expect from men in Adrian's orbit. Because you put yourself in front of a federal recorder to save my life, he said simply. And you didn't know me. You just... He stopped. You just did it, and you deserve to make the next choice with the whole picture. Nora stood by the window. The whole picture. She thought about the first night, the fish, the rain. His voice saying, I believe you, with a certainty that had lodged in her chest and stayed there. She thought about Elijah's scholarship essays, the way Adrian had said right, like you know you deserve it. She thought about 3 weeks of espresso set on tables without asking. She thought about the moment in the conference room when she'd given her name to a federal recorder and felt, underneath the fear, something that had felt like her own choice. She thought about the fact that the choice had been constructed, that the room she'd walked into had been built for her, that every step from the restaurant to the patio to the penthouse to the federal building had been, at least in its origin, engineered. The cold from the glass had moved through her palms and up her arms and was sitting in her shoulders now. She heard the connecting door open. She heard Adrian's footsteps stop. She heard the silence that meant he'd looked at Matteo's face and understood what had happened. She did not turn around. Nora, Adrian said. Don't, she said. Let me... I said don't. She turned then, because looking at the harbor was no longer sufficient, because she needed to look at him directly when she said the next thing. He was standing in the doorway between their two spaces, jacket on, and he was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the controlled stillness, not the weighted attention. Something raw. Something that looked like a man who had been caught and was deciding, in real time, whether to run from it or stand in it. He stood in it. She gave him that. How much, she said. How much was constructed? He held her gaze. The beginning, he said. The first night. The timing. The approach. The cartel knowing about me. A pause. I didn't engineer that, but He stopped. But you knew, she said slowly, that proximity to you made me a target, and you chose proximity anyway. He said nothing, which was its own answer. Matteo had stood and moved quietly toward the hall, and she was grateful for it, the instinct of a man who understood the architecture of a moment. She and Adrian were alone in the kitchen with the harbor going dark outside and the espresso machine cold on the counter, and the legal pad with its 23 pages sitting at the end of the table. And she looked at him, really looked, the way she had on the patio in the rain, the way she had across the conference table, the way she had in every ordinary midnight that had built itself into something she'd made the mistake of trusting. I signed a federal statement, she said. My old life is already gone. My brother is safe because of your money, and I hate that I can't make myself hate it enough. Her voice was very level. And all of it, started because you decided I was interesting and built a door and waited for me to walk through it. Yes, he said, that's all you have. What else is there? He said, and his voice was rough in a way she'd never heard before, the roughness of something abraded by honesty rather than effort. I can explain the calculation. I can tell you that the cartel threat became real faster than I'd anticipated, and everything after the parking lot was genuine. I can tell you that what I feel... He stopped. I can tell you things, but they all start from the same constructed beginning. I can't undo that. She looked at him for a long time. No, she said. You can't. She picked up the legal pad from the table, held it. I'm going to finish the federal case, she said, because it's the right thing, and because Matteo is alive, and because Black Harbor doesn't get to continue operating in this city. That doesn't change. She looked at him directly. But when it's done, when Elijah is safe, and the case is closed, and I have my life back, whatever's left of it, she paused. You're going to tell me the truth. All of it. From the beginning. Every calculation, every decision, every step. She held his gaze. And then I'll decide what I do with it. He looked at her. Agreed, he said. She went to her side of the apartment. She did not lock the connecting door. She didn't know what that meant yet. She lay on the bed in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to the city and thought about the woman who had stood in a rain-soaked patio 3 weeks ago and told a dangerous man she would burn his empire to the ground. And she thought about whether that woman and this one were the same person. And she thought that the answer was yes. And also, in some specific and unrecoverable way, No was not the same person she had been before. She knew this the way you know structural damage. Not from a single visible crack, but from the way the floor sits differently under your feet. The way doors that used to close flush now catch on the frame. The way the whole building has settled into a new geometry without asking your permission. She lay on the bed for 2 hours without sleeping. At some point, the city outside went fully dark, and then began its slow reversal toward gray, and she listened to it and thought about nothing specific, which meant she thought about everything without naming it, which was the only way she knew how to hold the volume of what had happened without it overwhelming the parts of her that needed to remain functional. She got up at 5:30. She ran the building's gym for 51 minutes, hard. The kind of run where you're not thinking about pace or form, just converting something internal into something physical, just making the body carry what the mind can't yet categorize. The treadmill's belt was loud in the empty gym, and the fluorescents were cold, and she ran until the sweat soaked through her shirt, and her calves were burning, and her lungs were asking a question she didn't answer. She just kept going. She showered. She dressed. She went back to the kitchen, and the connecting door was closed, but there was a cup of espresso on the counter, still hot, which meant he'd heard her come back, which meant he'd been awake. She drank it standing up. She did not knock on the door. The next 4 days had the quality of something stretched. The federal case was moving faster than Reyes had initially suggested. The Hargrove documentation had opened fissures that were spreading through Black Harbor's infrastructure in ways that would take months to fully map, but were already causing visible pressure. 2 of the syndicate's financial handlers had reached out through lawyers. One of the Port Authority officials had stopped answering calls from his usual contacts, which Reyes's team read correctly as a man going quiet before he flipped. Nora worked the case 6, sometimes 8 hours a day. She sat with federal prosecutors and walked them through the document architecture she'd built on the legal pad and expanded in the laptop, and she answered their questions with the precision of someone who had spent 2 years studying how criminal cases were constructed before life interrupted the education, and she watched the prosecutor's expressions shift over the course of each session from cautious assessment to something that looked like professional respect, which she noted and set aside because it was not the point. The point was Mateo alive. The point was Elijah's specialist appointment, which happened on a Tuesday, and for which she sat in a waiting room for 3 hours reading a magazine she didn't absorb while Elijah was inside with Dr. Holt. And when he came out, his face had the particular quality of someone who has just received information that is serious but manageable, the specific relief of a diagnosis that has a name, which is always better than a diagnosis that doesn't. Treatment plan, he said, sitting beside her. Okay. There's a protocol. It's not nothing, but He stopped. It's a path. She said there's a path. Nora looked at her brother. She put her hand over his. She did not say anything about who had paid for the appointment. She could not yet determine the right way to hold that truth, so she held it the only way available, which was carefully, with both hands, without looking at it directly. Adrian was present in the apartment the way weather is present, something you can feel in the atmospheric pressure without always seeing its source. They moved through the same spaces with the careful courtesy of 2 people who have agreed, without discussing it, to give each other room while the facts settle. He made espresso. She took it without commentary. He left documents on the table that she reviewed without asking why. She left her legal pad open to pages that contained her thinking, and he read them, she knew, because certain conversations they had afterward contained references that were too specific to be coincidence. They did not discuss the patio. They did not discuss Mateo's revelation. They were waiting, she thought, for something, some external event to create the pressure that would force the conversation, the way certain things can only be said when there's no longer any choice about saying them. The external event arrived on a Thursday, which seemed appropriate. Reyes called at 6:48 in the morning. "We have a problem," she said. The problem had a name. Vincent Caruso. Mid-level Black Harbor lieutenant, currently in federal custody since a Tuesday raid on a waterfront warehouse. He had, in exchange for a reduced agreement, provided information about the case against Black Harbor. Standard protocol. Expected. What was not expected was the specific detail he'd offered that his lawyer had used that morning to file a motion contesting the legality of the original tip that had led to the warehouse extraction. The tip that had been made through a prepaid phone. The tip that traced back to a number registered to an LLC that was one corporate layer removed from a property holding company that was 2 layers removed from Adrian's primary real estate operation. The defense is arguing the information was obtained through criminal enterprise and is therefore inadmissible, Reyes said. If the motion succeeds, the extraction evidence gets thrown, Caruso walks, and everything built on the warehouse intelligence, a pause. It unravels. Nora stood in the kitchen with the prepaid phone pressed to her ear and her free hand flat on the counter and her eyes on the harbor outside, which was going bright under a hard November sun that offered no warmth whatsoever. "How long do we have?" she said. "The motion hearing is in 72 hours. What do you need?" "We need independent corroboration of the warehouse location that doesn't trace back to Moretti's organization. One clean source. Something that puts those men in that building through a line of evidence that has no connection to criminal enterprise." Another pause. "Do you have anything?" Nora closed her eyes for 2 seconds. She thought about the sessions, the documents, the 23 pages of notes. She thought about what she'd heard in the penthouse's small hours, through the connecting door and over kitchen tables, and in the careful recitations of a man who had been carrying years of operational knowledge and had finally found someone he was willing to put it down in front of. She thought about one specific conversation 9 days ago in which Adrian had mentioned, without emphasis, a name she'd written in the margin of the legal pad rather than the main body because at the time it had seemed peripheral. She opened her eyes. "Give me 6 hours," she said. She found the name in the legal pad margin at 7:15. Marcus Teal, former Black Harbor logistics coordinator who had been quietly moved out of active operations 8 months ago after a dispute over payment. Not arrested, not flipped, just displaced. Living, according to Adrian's offhand mention, somewhere in the South End, doing work for a moving company, staying quiet with the particular quiet of a man who knows too much and is hoping nobody remembers that. She told Adrian at 7:32. He looked at her across the kitchen table. "Teal has no reason to talk to federal investigators," he said. "He has no reason to protect Black Harbor either," she said. "He got pushed out. He's been sitting on information that could destroy them for 8 months, and he hasn't used it because he's scared and because nobody's given him a structure that makes talking safer than staying quiet." She looked at the name in the margin. "I can give him that structure. You can't approach a former cartel associate alone. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm not offering permission. I'm stating a security fact. If Black Harbor has anyone watching Teal, and they may, he knows enough to make that plausible, you walk up to his door and they have exactly what they've been looking for since the warehouse." She looked at him. He looked back. "Come with me," she said. The silence. "If you come," she said, "it's because I asked. Because I'm making a choice to bring you. That's different than you engineering it." She held his gaze. "I know the difference." He stood up. "Let me make a call first," he said. They drove to the South End at 9:10 in a car she didn't recognize, one of Adrian's that she hadn't seen before, driven by a man whose name she wasn't given and didn't ask for. The city went by in the flat November light, the streets still holding the last of the morning rush, and she sat in the back with the legal pad and reviewed what she knew about Teal and thought about how to open a door with someone who had been keeping it locked for 8 months. The building was a 3-story brick walk-up on a narrow street 2 blocks from a park. Unremarkable. The kind of building that held people in the specific phase of life where unremarkable was the goal. They went in alone, just the 2 of them. The driver stayed with the car, 3rd floor, end of the hall. She knocked. The silence on the other side of the door lasted long enough to mean someone was looking through the peephole. "Mr. Teal," she said. "My name is Nora Vale. I'm working with the federal investigation into Black Harbor. I'm not law enforcement, I'm a civilian witness, and I'm here because I need your help, and I think you've been waiting for someone to give you a reason to give it." She paused. "I have 68 hours. That's how long you have to decide whether to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder or to put this behind you permanently." The chain came off. The door opened 4 inches. Marcus Teal was 51, heavy-set, with the eyes of a man who had been sleeping badly for 8 months. He looked at Nora. He looked at Adrian. Something moved across his face that was not quite fear and not quite relief, but lived somewhere between them. "You brought him," Teal said. "He came because I asked," Nora said. Teal looked at Adrian for a long moment. "You burning it down." "The parts that should burn," Adrian said. Another long moment. The door opened. They were inside for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Nora talked. Teal talked. Adrian said very little, which was the right instinct, and she was glad he had it. By the end, Teal had agreed to make a voluntary statement through his own attorney, a structure Nora had outlined that would provide him the maximum legal protection while delivering exactly the corroborating testimony Reyes needed to survive the admissibility motion. He shook Nora's hand at the door. He didn't shake Adrian's. Adrian didn't offer it. In the car back, Nora called Reyes and gave her Teal's attorney's name and told her to expect a call by end of day. And Reyes was quiet for a moment before saying, "How did you find him?" And Nora said, "Margin notes." And Reyes said, "Right," in the tone of someone choosing not to ask the next question. The drive back was quiet. At some point, not planned, Adrian's hand moved across the seat and covered hers for approximately 4 seconds, and then withdrew. She let it happen. She didn't look at him. Neither of them said anything. The admissibility motion failed. Reyes called at 11:40 the following morning and said the words with the controlled satisfaction of someone who had been in this business long enough to know that satisfaction is earned slowly and spent quickly, and you take each moment of it as it comes. The case held. Caruso's information stood. And Black Harbor, as of that afternoon, had 4 of its primary operatives in federal custody, 2 financial structures frozen, and a councilman who had just finished his 3rd meeting with federal prosecutors and was, by all indications, no longer interested in protecting anyone but himself. It should have felt like the worst was over. It felt, instead, like the eye of something. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Friday. Not Reyes. Not Mateo. The prepaid phone, unknown number, which meant someone had gotten a number that was not supposed to be findable. She answered because you answer. "Ms. Vale." The voice was male, accented, unhurried in the way of someone who had decided that urgency was for people with something to lose. "You have been very busy, the federal cooperation, the Teal arrangement." A pause. "You understand you've made something personal." She sat up in the dark. "Who is this?" she said, which she already knew was a useless question, and asked it anyway to buy 3 seconds of orientation. "My name is Dominic Farah," the voice said. "I run what remains of Black Harbor's eastern operations, which, because of you and your associate, is considerably less than it was." Another pause, deliberate, timed for effect. "I'm calling to let you know we're done working through institutions. Done with operations and motions and the particular patience of people who think legal systems are the real arena." His voice stayed level, flat, more frightening for the flatness. "Your brother is studying at the Boylston Library right now. He's been there since 7 p.m. He orders the same coffee every time. Large, dark roast, no sugar. He sits at the second table from the window on the east side." The cold hit her so fast and complete it was almost physical, a wave that started in her sternum and went outward to her hands, her face. "He leaves at 10:30, Farah said. "That's in—" A pause. 41 minutes. She was already out of bed. "If you want a different outcome," Farah said, "you will come to the address I'm going to give you. Alone. No federal contact. No Moretti." A pause. "You have 30 minutes to get here, 41 to get to the library. The math will tell you which one to choose." The address came through as a text immediately after he hung up. She stood in the dark bedroom for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all she allowed herself. She went to the connecting door and pounded on it twice, hard, and it opened in 4 seconds and Adrian was already awake, already reading her face, and she said, "Elijah, Boylston Library. Right now. Get someone there right now." And she was already moving back across the room for her jacket and her shoes and the prepaid phone. "Nora, someone is going to the library and someone else is going to text this address to Reyes," she said, and she held up the text on her phone for him to see. "And then I'm going to the address." "No," he said. "Absolutely not." "He's there right now, Adrian." Her voice was completely level, which was the only way she knew how to be when the thing that could break her was directly in front of her. "My brother is in that library right now and I have 30 minutes, and if you want to argue about what I should do with my 30 minutes, then we can do that. But I'm going to this address either way." He looked at her. She looked back. "Then I'm going with you," he said. They said alone. They said a lot of things. He was already moving, jacket, phone, the particular economy of motion of someone who had been in rooms like this one, making decisions like this one, more times than she could count, and she felt the strange dual awareness of watching a man become exactly what he was while simultaneously understanding that right now, in this specific moment, what he was exactly what she needed. Mateo was called in transit. 2 of Adrian's people were at the library in 11 minutes. She knew because Mateo texted her a photo of Elijah at his second from the window table, coffee in hand, completely unaware, and the relief that hit her was so sharp it was almost pain. Elijah was safe. She and Adrian pulled up to the address at 2:49 a.m. It was a decommissioned fish processing plant on the inner harbor, 3 blocks from the waterfront, the kind of building that had been waiting for redevelopment funding for 15 years and had instead just waited, accumulating darkness and the particular smell of a space that had processed death for decades and never quite stopped. 2 men outside. She counted them from the car. "There are more inside," Adrian said, his voice very quiet. "Yes." "Nora, I know. If this goes wrong, it's not going to go wrong," she said, and she said it not because she believed it completely, but because the alternative to saying it was paralysis, and paralysis was not available. She opened the car door. The harbor wind hit her face, cold and salt-raw and indifferent, and she walked toward the building's entrance with her shoulders straight and her hands visible in the particular way of moving she'd developed over years of walking into rooms where she was not entirely welcome and refusing to let her body announce it. The 2 men outside looked at her. They looked at Adrian, who had fallen in at her left shoulder. One of them said something into an earpiece. The door opened from inside. The processing floor was large and cold and lit by work lights clamped to the structural beams overhead, casting pools of yellow-white that left the corners in dark and made the space feel simultaneously too large and too close. Old machinery stood in covered shapes along the walls. The floor was bare concrete, faintly stained in the specific way of industrial spaces that had seen a great deal of liquid over the years, and Nora did not look at it too closely. Dominic Farah stood in the center of the floor. He was older than his voice, mid-50s, silver-haired, wearing a coat that was expensive and old, the kind of expensive that had given up caring about current. He had the face of a man who had been making cold calculations for 30 years and had metabolized the coldness so completely it no longer read as cruelty, just as weather. He looked at Nora with something like appreciation. He looked at Adrian with something older than appreciation. "You brought him," he said, echoing Teal with a tone that meant something entirely different. "He came because I asked," Nora said. Same answer, different room. Farah almost smiled. "Ms. Vale, you've been remarkable. The federal cooperation, the case architecture, the Teal arrangement, genuinely remarkable for someone who was serving sea bass 3 weeks ago." He tilted his head slightly. "Which is why I wanted to meet you, before the end of this particular chapter." "What do you want?" she said. "I want you to withdraw your federal testimony," he said. "All of it. Every document, every deposition, every corroborating arrangement, formally, on the record, with your name attached." He paused. "In exchange, Black Harbor removes itself entirely from Adrian Moretti's operational territory, permanently. He gets the city. You get your brother's safety. Everyone gets what they actually want." The work lights hummed above. "And if I don't," she said, "then what happened to my operations in the last 11 days happens to the things you care about," he said. Simply, without heat. "I'm not threatening you dramatically. I'm giving you a business proposition. The cost of continuing is higher than the value of the outcome. That's the math." Nora looked at him. She looked at the room. She counted, in her peripheral vision, 4 more men in the shadows at the room's edges, which meant 6 total, which meant this had not been arranged casually. She looked at Adrian. He was watching Farah with the stillness she had come to understand was not passivity, but its opposite, the stillness of someone who has already decided and is waiting for the moment to become available. She looked back at Farah. "No," she said. Farah's expression didn't change. "Ms. Vale, no," she said again. "I'm not withdrawing the testimony. I'm not making an arrangement with you. I'm not—" She held his gaze fully, the way she'd held every gaze in every room that had tried to make her feel small enough to comply. "I'm not going to let you make this about math. What Black Harbor has done to people in this city is not a balance sheet. It is not a negotiating position. And I am not something you get to move around a board." The silence in the processing floor was very complete. Farah looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Adrian. "You understand what she's just committed you to?" "Yes," Adrian said. "There's no—" What happened next happened in the compressed, overlapping way that violence happens when it has been approaching for a while and finally arrives. Not one thing after another, but several things simultaneously, all of them loud. Adrian moved at the same moment the door behind them opened, and the 2 things happened in the same second, and Nora dropped low instinctively, the instinct of someone who had never been trained for this, but whose body understood threat gradients, and the sound that filled the processing floor was enormous and disorienting, and she pressed herself against the base of the nearest covered machinery and kept her head down and felt the cold concrete against her palms, and thought, with extraordinary clarity, about Elijah at the library table with his coffee and his scholarship drafts, and she held on to that image, the way you hold on to something solid when the floor has stopped being solid. And she thought about what she'd said on the patio weeks ago in the rain. "I will burn your empire to the ground." She thought about the fact that somewhere between saying that and now, the empire she'd meant to burn had changed, or she had changed, or the line between those 2 things had become impossible to locate, and she thought about choices, not the ones that had been constructed for her, not the ones she'd made without full information, but the ones she'd made in the last 72 hours with her eyes completely open. The teal conversation and the legal pad and the recorder in the federal building and this room, tonight, this specific decision she'd just made in front of a man who would not forgive it. A hand closed around her arm, Mateo's voice in her ear, "Move now." She moved. The processing floor was chaos in the yellow-white pools of the work lights, and she moved through it with Mateo's hand on her arm and her eyes forward, and she did not look for Adrian because she could not afford to look for Adrian. And then she heard his voice, 3 words, sharp and clear, cutting through the noise with the precision of someone whose voice had been built for exactly this kind of room. And she exhaled one ragged breath of relief and she kept moving. Through a side door Mateo had already forced open, out into the harbor air, the cold hitting her face like something thrown, salt and diesel, and the particular dark of a waterfront at 3 in the morning where the lights of the city reflected off water that couldn't care less about any of it. She heard the processing floor behind her. Sounds she didn't have clean words for. The sounds of a space being used for something it wasn't designed for. And she ran because Mateo was running and because her legs understood the instruction before her mind fully issued it. They came out onto a concrete loading dock above the water. Mateo stopped, turned, looked back at the door they'd come through. Nora stopped beside him and her lungs were asking serious questions and she answered them by breathing, hard, hands on her knees for exactly 3 seconds before she straightened. "Adrian," she said. 30 seconds, Mateo said. He was watching the door. "Mateo, but—" 30 seconds, Nora. She watched the door. The 30 seconds were the longest she'd experienced since Elijah's surgery waiting room, which had lasted 4 hours and felt like a country she'd had to live in for a while and then finally been allowed to leave. The door opened at 27. Adrian came through it with one hand pressed flat against his left side and his jacket open and his face doing the thing it did when it was working hard not to show something, which she recognized now. The specific set of his jaw, the way his breathing was controlled at the top, slightly ragged beneath. He looked at Matteo, then at Nora. "Move," he said. "We're not done." "You're hurt," she said. "Move first." They moved. The car was 2 blocks north and the driver had it running, and they were in it and pulling away from the waterfront before Nora had fully processed the sequence. And in the back seat she turned to Adrian and said, "Show me," with a voice that did not ask. And he looked at her for a moment and then moved his hand and showed her. A cut. Deep, along the lower left ribs, the kind of thing that happens when something sharp moves faster than the person it's moving toward. Not an arterial situation. She'd watched enough of Elijah's medical appointments to understand the difference between serious and fatal, but deep enough that the shirt underneath his hand was entirely dark and his breathing had the shallow quality of someone managing pain actively. "Hospital," she said. "No hospital. There's someone—" "Adrian." "There's someone on call," he said. "Matteo knows. 20 minutes. She looked at Matteo in the front seat. 20 minutes, Matteo confirmed, already on the phone. She looked back at Adrian. She pressed her own hand over his against his side, adding pressure, which made him go very still, and she held it there and felt his breathing against the side of her hand and watched the city move past the windows and said nothing, because there was too much to say, and the saying of it would have to wait for a room that wasn't moving. The someone on call was a doctor named Pell, who worked out of a medical suite on the 4th floor of a building in the back bay that looked, from the outside, like a very ordinary professional office, and was, inside, equipped with the specific thoroughness of a facility designed to handle situations that couldn't go through normal channels. Doctor. Pell was in her 50s, gray-haired, unhurried in the way of people who had seen every version of urgent and had decided to be the calm in each one. She looked at the wound and said table. And Adrian got on the table, and Nora stood in the corner of the room while Pell worked, and she watched, and her hands were in fists at her sides, and she made herself unclench them because clenching was a luxury. It took 41 minutes. When it was done, Adrian was upright on the edge of the table with 8 sutures in his side and a look on his face that was somewhere between exhaustion and the particular irritation of someone who has been injured in a way that impedes their normal function and finds this personally offensive. Pell gave him instructions he probably wouldn't fully follow. He thanked her with the genuine brevity of someone who has been in debt to the same people many times and knows that overstating it doesn't change the ledger. In the car back, he said, "Fera." "I know," Matteo said from the front. "Clean." "I know." Nora looked out the window. "He got out of the building," Adrian said. "Not a question." "With 2 of his people," Matteo said. "The others are—" He paused in the way of someone choosing a word. "Handled." "He'll try to run," Adrian said. "He doesn't have enough left to fight. He'll try to get to the New York network and re-establish." "Reyes needs to know," Nora said. Both of them looked at her. "The federal case is the mechanism that makes this permanent," she said, "not whatever happened in that building tonight. If Farah gets absorbed by a New York operation and Black Harbor reconstitutes somewhere else in a year, tonight meant nothing." She met Adrian's eyes. "Reyes needs his current location. Do you have it?" A pause. "I can have it in 2 hours," Adrian said. "Then get it." He got it. She called Reyes at 6:15 a.m. from the penthouse kitchen, standing at the counter with espresso she'd made herself, because Adrian was on the couch, under a blanket Elijah had inexplicably produced and placed over him with the matter-of-fact care of someone who had decided to absorb the situation by being useful. And she told Reyes about Farah and the processing plant and the conversation she'd had before everything went sideways. And she gave Reyes the location data Adrian's network had produced, and she listened to Reyes' silence and understood that the silence was Reyes deciding how many questions to ask about how Nora had obtained the information. Reyes asked 2. Nora answered them without embellishment. "I'll need a formal statement," Reyes said. "I know." "This week." "I know." A pause. "Vale, you understand what last night constitutes in terms of your ongoing status as a federal witness." "Complicated it," Nora said. Significantly. I know. I'll be in your office Monday. She hung up. She drank the espresso. Through the living room doorway, she could see Elijah, who had come home from the library at Mateo's instruction around 11 the previous night with a confused expression that had shifted over the course of the next hour into a controlled version of the fear he worked hard never to show Nora, and who had then proceeded to make himself useful in the particular way of someone who needed to act because feeling was too large for the room. He had made toast at 2 in the morning. He had found the blanket for Adrian. He was asleep now, on the couch's opposite end, feet tucked under himself, one of his scholarship drafts half fallen from his hand. Nora looked at her brother asleep. She looked at Adrian, who was not asleep. His eyes were open and on the harbor through the window, and he had the look of a man doing quiet inventory of the previous 12 hours and reaching conclusions that cost him something. She went and sat in the chair across from them both. Nobody said anything for a while. "You made toast," she said eventually, to the room in general. "He made toast," Adrian said, still looking at the window. "It was 2 in the morning." "Toast is appropriate at 2 in the morning," Elijah said, from under the scholarship draft, eyes still closed. "Don't talk to me about toast." Nora looked at the ceiling. For the first time she counted backward and could not precisely determine. She felt something in her chest that was not threat assessment or forward planning or the managed compression of things she couldn't yet afford to feel. It was something closer to the floor of her, the actual foundation, whatever it was, that had been holding the building up through the weeks of emergency. It was very tired, but it was still there. Dominic Farah was arrested at a private airfield in Providence, Rhode Island, at 10:47 that morning, 37 minutes before the charter flight he'd arranged was scheduled to depart. He was taken into federal custody on charges that Reyes's team had been assembling since before dawn, charges built on testimony and documentation and the specific corroborating architecture that Nora had spent 11 days constructing in a penthouse kitchen on a legal pad with a pen she'd pressed too hard through the first sheet. Nora learned this from Reyes via text at 11:53 while sitting in the waiting room of Dr. Pell's office, where Adrian was having his sutures checked and his instructions reissued with the tone of someone who has given instructions before and has accurate expectations about their reception. She read the text twice. She put the phone in her pocket. She sat with it. Not triumph. That wasn't what it felt like. It felt like the particular exhaustion of something that has been straining against resistance for a long time finally meeting the absence of resistance, the sudden loss of the thing you'd been pushing against, and the disorientation that follows. She thought about the bouncer case, 3 years ago, the 4 hours of cross-examination, the defense attorney with the expensive suit who had used her word choices against her and implied things about her credibility and her motivations and her character, and the way she'd sat in that chair and answered every question and refused, absolutely refused, to let the refusal show on her face. She thought about walking out of that courthouse into the sun and sitting on a bench for 20 minutes before she could make her legs work normally. This felt like that, but larger, like a version of that same exhaustion that had been accumulating across a much longer fight. Adrian came out of the exam room and saw her face and said nothing, which was the right call, and sat beside her in the waiting room with his jacket on carefully over the sutures and his hands loose in his lap, and they sat there together in the ordinary fluorescent light of a waiting room with a plant in the corner that needed watering and a magazine rack with nothing in it less than 4 months old, and the city went about its Friday outside the windows, indifferent and complete. "Farah's in custody," she said. "I know," he said. Mateo had told him, she assumed, his network. "The case holds," she said. "Without the admissibility challenge and without Farah to hold the Eastern operations together, Black Harbor doesn't have the structural coherence to reconstitute. Not here. Not quickly enough to matter." She looked at her hands. "It's over." He said nothing for a moment. "For them," he said. "Yes. Not for us." She looked at him. "There's still the conversation," he said. "The one you asked for. All of it. From the beginning." He met her eyes, and his face had the quality she'd learned to read as his version of vulnerability. Not softness, but the absence of the usual management, the thing underneath the stillness when the stillness had nothing left to protect. "I told you I'd tell you the truth when it was done. It's done." She looked at him. Not here, she said. No, not here. They went to the ocean, not that day. That day was for sleep, for Elijah's specialist follow-up call, for the particular domestic silence of a shared space that had just come through something and needed to breathe. Adrian slept for 6 hours and woke and sat at the kitchen table reviewing whatever needed reviewing, and Nora ran the gym again and showered and sat with Elijah and read while he worked, and they ordered food from somewhere neither of them had to think about, and the evening went the way evenings go when the emergency has passed and the body doesn't yet know how to return to ordinary speed. It was the following Sunday when they went. A beach 40 minutes north of the city, off a state road that turned to gravel and then to packed sand. The kind of place that in July would have been crowded and in November was empty. Completely and cleanly empty. Just the gray sand and the gray water and the sky above it pressing down with the particular November weight of clouds that had decided to stay. They walked to the water's edge. The wind was serious. It came off the Atlantic with the full authority of open water behind it, tearing at Nora's jacket and her hair that she'd left loose, which she immediately regretted on practical grounds. And beside her, Adrian stood with his hands in his pockets and his face into the wind and the scar along his jaw very visible in the flat gray light. She waited. He talked. He told her about the Charlestown case first, the bouncer, the 3 women, the victim whose father he'd owed a debt to. A debt not of money, but of the older kind, the kind where someone had put themselves in danger for your benefit once, and the ledger stays open. He told her he'd followed Nora's testimony remotely, through a lawyer who attended the proceedings, and that what he'd read in the transcript had done something to him that he didn't fully understand at the time and had spent months afterward trying to locate in himself. You didn't move, he said. 4 hours of someone trying to dismantle you, and you didn't move. I was terrified, she said. I know, the transcript didn't show it. That's the thing. He looked at the water. I've been in rooms with people who were terrified and knew how to hide it for professional reasons. That's a skill. What you did was different. You were terrified and you decided the testimony mattered more than the terror. That's not a skill. That's a choice. He paused. I hadn't seen that in a long time, in anyone. The waves came in and went back. And so you built a door, she said. And so I built a door, he said. She looked at the water, the restaurant, the timing, the swordfish. Yes. The cartel identifying me as leverage. You said that wasn't engineered, but you knew proximity to you made anyone a target. Yes. You chose proximity anyway. Yes. He turned to look at her fully, the wind at his back now. I told myself it was managed, that I could keep you at enough distance that the exposure was theoretical, that I'd been careful about my personal life for years, and this was... He stopped. I was wrong, and by the time I understood I was wrong, the parking lot had already happened and you were already in the car, and I told myself the relocation was protection, and it also wasn't only that. No, she said, it wasn't. I wanted you close, he said. I rationalized the mechanism. The want was real. She absorbed this. The wind moved her hair across her face, and she pulled it back with her hand and held it there. Elijah's specialist, she said. Before the cartel identified me. That was a calculated gesture. Yes. You used my brother's illness as a way to create a connection I hadn't chosen. Yes. Say it plainly. He held her gaze. I used your brother's illness to get closer to you before you'd agreed to any proximity, before you knew who I was in any specific way. He paused. It was wrong. The word landed in the cold air and stayed there. Nora looked at him. She thought about Elijah in the kitchen with the appointment card between them. She thought about standing at the window of the penthouse looking at the harbor and feeling something she hadn't been able to name yet. She thought about 23 pages of notes on a legal pad and a federal recorder and a man who had told her, write like, you know you deserve it to her brother at midnight over a scholarship draft. And she thought about his hand over hers in the car after the Teal meeting, 4 seconds, no commentary. She thought about all the ways a thing could be 2 true things simultaneously. I know it was wrong, she said. I'm not asking for... I know you're not. She turned toward him slightly, the wind now hitting her left side. Here's what I need you to understand. The Elijah gesture. That was a manipulation. I can name it that clearly, and I do. The cartel, the relocation, the proximity, those were constructed conditions that I walked into without full information. I can name those things too. She held his gaze. And all of that is true. And also, she paused. Also, inside those constructed conditions, things happened that were real. The espresso at midnight, the scholarship draft, the conversation about your father where you said explicitly that you didn't want absolution. She paused again. The recording in the federal building, the Teal conversation, the processing plant. Her voice was level and very specific. Those were my choices. Not yours. Mine. Made with my eyes open, inside a situation I didn't choose, which is actually how most choices happen. She looked at the water. I don't know how to cleanly separate the manipulation from the real thing. I've tried, and I can't. They're too entangled. She looked back at him. But I know the difference between a person who manipulated me and a person who is only manipulation. And you're not only that. The water came in. I'm still angry, she said. I know. I'll probably keep being angry for a while. That's fair. Don't tell me what's fair, she said. Not harshly, just clearly. He almost smiled. The wind caught it. Okay, he said. They stood at the water's edge for a long time after that without talking, which had a different quality than all the other not talking they'd done. The midnight kitchen silences and the car ride after Teal and the waiting room that morning. This silence was settled. It had the texture of something that had been through the pressure and come out the other side still intact, not unchanged. Nothing that goes through that kind of pressure comes out unchanged, but intact, still structural. The clouds broke slightly in the west. A thin line of light appeared above the water, low on the horizon, and the gray Atlantic caught it and held it for a few minutes before the clouds closed back. Nora watched it happen. She thought about the waitress she had been 6 weeks ago, rolling silverware in a service station at 11:45 on a Thursday night, thinking about nothing beyond the next task, the next shift, the next payment toward a life that had been narrowing so gradually she'd stopped noticing the walls coming in. She tried to locate that person and found she could. She was still there, fully. The memory of her had not been replaced by anything, but the woman standing at the water's edge was carrying more now. A federal case, a testimony, a record. A brother whose specialist had used the word path, a choice made on a rain-soaked patio that she understood now had not been the first step in a road laid out for her, but the first step in a road she'd been building herself, even if the materials had come from somewhere she hadn't fully mapped. She thought about what she'd said on the patio. I will burn your empire to the ground. She thought about the fact that she had, in a way, not with fire, with paper, with testimony, with 23 pages of notes in a legal pad and a voice that hadn't moved in a federal conference room any more than it had moved in a courthouse 3 years ago. She thought that the woman who'd said it had meant it as a threat. She thought that the woman standing here had done something closer to making it true, and that the way it had actually happened was stranger and more expensive and more entangled than the threat had imagined, and that this was generally how things were. She turned from the water. I'm going back to school, she said. Adrian looked at her. Criminal justice. Full time. I talked to the admissions office at Suffolk last week. She looked at him directly. The federal case, the work I did on the architecture, the witness coordination. Reyes has offered a consulting arrangement, part-time, while I study. She paused. It pays enough. Between that and the staff fund continuation, it's enough. He was quiet for a moment, reading her face. You're telling me you don't need the penthouse. I'm telling you I've decided what I'm doing with my life, she said, which is something I hadn't been able to say clearly in 2 years. She held his gaze. And I'm telling you because you're part of what made it possible to say it. Not the way you planned, but still. The wind moved between them. When do you leave? He said. End of the month. He nodded once, looked at the water. The Empire? He said it in the tone of someone picking up something they've been putting down and examining for a while. There are changes, already in motion, some of them. He paused. The trafficking operations? Those are gone. Permanently. The protection arrangements are being restructured. Salaries rather than cuts. Territorial disputes go through Mateo before anyone moves. He said each thing flatly. Not as virtue, but as fact. The way you report structural decisions rather than moral transformations. I'm not going to tell you it's clean. I know it's not. But it's different than it was. She looked at him. Because of the case, he said. And because... He stopped. Looked at the water. Back at her. Because I've been in this business for 12 years and I'd stopped being able to see it from the outside. And then someone corrected my fish order and I started seeing it from the outside again. And I couldn't stop. He paused. That's the most I can honestly say about it. Nora looked at the thin scar along his jaw, the wind at his coat, the eyes that had first looked at her across a dining room and seen something she was still deciding how to feel about being seen. That's enough, she said. They walked back from the water, the gravel road, the car, the drive back to the city in the flat November light, neither of them talking, the radio off, the Atlantic receding in the rearview mirror until the road curved and it disappeared. The weeks after had their own shape. Elijah received his first scholarship offer on a Tuesday, MEM-YT, full funding, and he called Nora from the library, and she could hear in his voice the particular quality of something long held finally releasing, a tension that had been so constant it had become part of the background frequency of their lives. And she sat down on the stairs of the Federal Building where she'd been walking between meetings and pressed her back against the wall and let herself cry for approximately 90 seconds, which was all she allowed, and then she stood up and went back to work. She moved out of the penthouse on a Saturday with the same 2 bags she'd arrived with, plus a third for the books that had accumulated, and Elijah carried the 3rd bag without commentary. Adrian was not there when she left, which she had not arranged and had not arranged. He was simply not there, which was a thing that could be read several ways, and she chose to read it as the simplest one, which was that some departures are easier without an audience. Mateo was there. He carried her 3rd bag to the elevator. At the elevator, he said, "He'll be at Bellavino on Thursday." She looked at him. "Table 12, Mateo said. "He'll order the sea bass. He won't look up when you walk in." She stepped into the elevator. "I'm not working Thursdays for 3 weeks," she said. Mateo held the elevator door for a moment. "He'll be there the Thursday after that too," he said, and let the door close. She went back to the apartment. Her apartment, hers and Elijah's, which was smaller than it had been before and exactly the right size. She unpacked her 3 bags. She put the books on the shelf in the order she intended to read them. She hung the framed photo of their mother, which she had been keeping in a drawer because there was no right wall for it in the penthouse, on the wall beside the kitchen window, where the morning light would catch it at the right angle. She stood back and looked at it. Her mother had been 29 in the photo, dark-haired, wearing a yellow shirt Nora didn't remember, laughing at something outside the frame. She looked, in the photo, like someone who had just heard a very good piece of news and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. Nora looked at her mother's face for a long time. Then she went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table with her laptop and her new enrollment confirmation from Suffolk and the consulting arrangement Reyes had sent over as a formal document requiring her signature, and she looked at the 2 things side by side on the screen and thought about what they added up to, and found that they added up to something she could name, not safety. Nothing she could reach in her life would be cleanly called that, not certainty. She had spent 6 weeks learning, in the most specific and expensive possible way, the limits of certainty as a thing you could hold, something else, direction. The sense of moving deliberately towards something she had chosen, with knowledge of the costs, with clear eyes about the terrain. She signed the consulting document. She closed the laptop. She drank her coffee. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday night, she walked into Bellavino at 8:45 in the new coat she'd bought with her first consulting payment and her hair down because the wind outside had settled, and for once she hadn't needed to fight it. The dining room was full in the way it always was on Thursdays. The kitchen noise came through the service door in its familiar roar. The amber lights were exactly as she'd left them. Marco looked up from his corner table and saw her, and the look on his face was something between relief and the specific satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for a thing to return to its right place. She walked to the service station. She tied on an apron. She worked. At 9:20, she came through the dining room with water for table 9 and saw, without breaking stride, without changing anything about the way she was moving, that table 12 had a man at it. Jacket, no tie, head down, looking at something in his hand. Not a phone, she saw as she passed, a folded piece of paper, one of the cards from the table, the kind with the nightly specials printed on them. She refilled table 9's water. She moved back toward the service station. She did not look at table 12. At 9:47, the expediter flagged her. 12 is asking for a recommendation. She looked at him. Seabass is good tonight, she said. He knows, the expediter said. He's asking anyway. She was quiet for a moment. She picked up a water pitcher. She crossed to table 12. Adrian looked up from the specials card when her shadow fell across the table. His face was... She looked at it directly and found it doing the same thing it always did in her presence. The thing she had never fully learned to categorize, the stillness that was not stillness, the attention that did not perform itself. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across a rain-soaked patio, across a kitchen table at midnight, across a processing plant floor in terrible light with his hand pressed to his side. The sea bass, she said. It came in this morning. The kitchen did something with a caper and blood orange that Raymond will describe at length if you ask, but it's worth it. A pause. And if I don't ask, he said. It's still worth it, she said. She refilled his water. She walked back to the service station. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Outside the amber windows of Bellavino, the city moved in its ordinary and complicated way. The late commuters, the couples, the delivery drivers, the taxis, the particular democracy of a city that contained everything simultaneously and cared about none of it specifically. The November wind had come up off the harbor again, and it moved through the streets with purpose. Inside the restaurant, Nora Vale worked her section with the economy of someone who has been doing this a long time, and also the awareness of someone who knows that this particular version of this particular life has an expiration date. Not because it will end badly, but because it is already, quietly, becoming something else. A semester that started in January, an office in a federal building 2 mornings a week, a brother in Cambridge studying things that would matter, and somewhere in the amber light of table 12, a man who had started everything with a calculated restaurant visit and had ended up somewhere he hadn't calculated, eating sea bass he'd been told to order, alone with the specific weight of someone who is learning, late and imperfectly, that the things you engineer and the things that are real are not always the same list. Sometimes the door you build is real too. Sometimes the person who walks through it walks back out on their own terms, and that is not a failure of the construction. That is the construction finally doing what it was actually for. Nora set a dessert down at table 4. She smiled at the couple at table 7 who were celebrating something and asked if they wanted to see the dessert menu, and they did, so she got it. She moved through the dining room that smelled like garlic and wine and burning butter and the good specific life of a place where people come to eat and talk and be briefly taken care of, and she did not look at table 12 again. She didn't need to. He was there. She was here. And between those two facts, something that had no clean name and needed none existed quietly in the amber light, imperfect and unresolved and precisely as real as anything she had ever chosen, which was, in the end, enough.